We've gone through a number of things on this, and we're sort of wrapping it up. We've gone through an introduction to the subject of God's law. We went through all about the law in terms of different words and terms that are used and what changes the New Testament made in the law. Then we went through physical laws. We went through civil laws and statutes. We went through tithing specifically. We went through ceremonial laws. And this evening we're going to go through the subject of spiritual laws. That to sort of wrap up this Bible study, to get an overview. I won't go back over all what we've covered earlier in the series, but let's go to the book of Romans to begin with. Romans chapter 3 to sort of set the stage. We read here in Romans 3, verse 20, "Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin." By the deeds of the law, or the works of the law, the phrase is the same. In other words, justification, which means being made innocent. There's nothing you and I can physically do to earn our innocence before God. Because, as verse 23 says, we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. So we all, therefore, stand in need of justification. Now, the ceremonial law, as we went through last time, the ceremonial law pointed out lessons about being justified, but the ceremonial law, which really were the works of the law, those ceremonies, those rituals, those works of the law, could not in reality justify. We went through that in Hebrews last time, that by the shedding of the blood of bulls and goats, there's only a remembrance made. But that does not pay the penalty for sin. If there's something you and I could do to earn innocence, then Christ didn't have to die. It makes empty the death of Christ, because that means there would have been another way. So Paul emphasizes that there's nothing you and I can do. There's no ceremony, there's no ritual, there's no labor, there's no effort that can justify us. The law is not given to justify. The law defines sin. By the law is the knowledge of sin. Now, does that mean the law's bad? No, that just means that if it weren't for the law, you wouldn't know what sin was. You wouldn't know what the speed limit was unless there was a law that said, 55 or 65 or 35 or whatever it says. The law spells out, and apart from the law, you wouldn't know. You could go around the world and people have all sorts of customs and ideas. You've had tribes that were headhunters and cannibals and people that offered human sacrifice and every sort of terrible thing that's imaginable that people have done to one another. And as far as they were concerned, as far as their conscience was concerned, they had a clear conscience, they didn't feel guilty about it. When some New Guinea headhunter, ate his neighbor and shrunk his head down, he didn't have a guilty conscience. He may have had indigestion, but he didn't have a guilty conscience because, he believed that was fine. He believed that was okay. And you can go through, different customs, different cultures all around the world. Some of the most horrible things that you can imagine people have done to one another. And so the law, by the law, is the knowledge of sin. See, we come on down a little further, and we find that how we are justified in verse 24. See, we've all sinned. We're justified by His grace through the redemption that's in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth to be a propitiation through faith in His blood, to declare His righteousness for the remission of sins that are past, through the forbearance of God. That doesn't mean you can continue to just live any old way and God doesn't care. It's not turning grace into license, but it's saying that when you repent, Christ died to pay for your sins. And so we come on down to verse 28. Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith, without or apart from the deeds of the law, the works of the law. Now, verse 31, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid, yea, we establish the law. See, this doesn't have anything to do with doing away with the law, but we're justified by faith. We're made innocent through our faith in Jesus Christ as our personal Savior, in His shed blood, apart from any of the rituals, any of the ceremonies that are spelled out in the law. Those are not the means to innocence and to access to God. That doesn't mean that the law is done away. God forbid. Yea, we establish the law. And that word establish is translated throughout the Old Testament as establish, confirm, stand firm in. So the law is, the fact that the law is in force and effect for God's people is certainly very much here in the Scriptures. Let's notice one other place in Romans 7, and then we'll go back to the Old Testament. In Romans 7 and verse 7, well, let's pick it up in verse 6. Now we are delivered from the law. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're delivered, that you don't need to keep the law? No. The law has a penalty. The law has a penalty, and the penalty of sin, the wages of sin, is death. We just got through seeing that. In Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. We've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. Sin is the transgression of the law. So we're delivered. We're delivered from the penalty that the law exacts. We're delivered from death. Being dead wherein we were held, we were as good as dead. But now we're set free because Christ died in our stead. That we should serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. You know, the Pharisees served in the letter. And they were always figuring ways to get around the spirit and intent of the law by sticking to the letter. You know, the Jews, for instance, give you an example of the difference between the spirit and the letter. Back in Leviticus and in Numbers, Deuteronomy, when it discusses the subject of tithing, it says, when you come into the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall do this, this, and this. Well, you know what? Did you know that the Jews don't tithe today? Well, their excuse for not tithing is the fact that it says, at least the Jews in the United States, they say, we're not in the land. We're not in Israel. And it says, when you come into the land that the Lord your God gives you. Well, now, what was the context? They were wandering around out in the desert. They didn't have anything to tithe on. What were they going to tithe on? Manna? God was giving them enough to eat. They didn't have anything to tithe on. He said, when you come into the land, receive the inheritance. Once you're working, once you have something, then you start tithing. But you see, what they focused on is the letter. Is there a way we can get out of tithing? We're not in the land. And so they have come up with all sorts of reasoning. That's what Christ used to get after them for. He says, you make void, you make void the law of God that you may hold to your own traditions. You hold your own customs. You got your own ways of doing it that reason around the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is the intent of the law. Was it God's purpose that the only thing you should tithe on was grapes in the land of Israel? That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. I mean, you can go through, and we went through it a couple of times ago. I don't want to rehash it all. But, you can go back to Genesis 14 and Abraham and the example of Isaac or Jacob rather, and go to Hebrews 7 and go to various places. And it was obvious that people who had a godly mindset recognized that the Lord High God is the possessor of heaven and earth, and they recognized that the tithe belonged to God. But you see, it's a difference in the way you look at the Bible. And Paul has said, look, we're delivered from the death penalty that the law has exacted. We were as good as dead. We were under condemnation. We were in the prisoner's dock in the courtroom, and we had been pronounced guilty, and the death sentence had been pronounced. But now we're delivered. Christ has delivered us. He didn't deliver us so we could go out and commit adultery and start making idols and murder our neighbors. I mean, that's not what delivered from the law is. So you can go out and bow down to idols and mow your yard on the Sabbath or whatever it may be. It's not His intent to do away with the law. It's a matter that we're to serve in newness of spirit, in the real intent. See, what shall we say? Is the law sin? God forbid. I wouldn't have known sin, but by the law. For I've not known lust, except the law said, "You shall not covet." Paul said, "Look, it's not that there's a problem with the law. There's no problem with the law. The law defines sin. The law does exactly what it was intended to do." Paul says, "I wouldn't have known that there was anything wrong with lusting, except I looked in the commandment and it says, 'Thou shalt not covet.'" Now, what law was Paul talking about? Do you think? What law says, "Thou shalt not covet"? I mean, a person doesn't have to be too much of a scholar to figure that one out. So Paul says, look, the point of the law is to tell us what's right and what's wrong. How do you know what's pleasing to God and what's not unless God tells you? Any of us as human parents, we have little kids, you tell them, do this, don't do that. Now, you tell them because you know what's best. But they don't know what pleases you, and they certainly don't understand what's best unless you tell them. And so God tells us. Now, Paul goes through this in verse 12. He says, the law is holy, the commandment is holy and just and good. He says in verse 14, we know that the law is spiritual. I'm carnal, sold under sin. You see, the problem's not the law, the problem's us. God doesn't set out to change the law to be like us. He sets out to change us to be like the law. Because the law reflects His mind. Paul goes on down in verse 22, he says, I delight in the law of God after the inward man. After the inward man. But he says, I've got something else warring in my members. There's a struggle going on inside of me. That, because he says, with my mind, in verse 25, I serve the law of God. I've made up my mind to live God's way. But with the flesh, the law of sin, I'm being pulled, the pulls of the flesh, my human nature, is pulling me toward sin. With my mind, I've made a decision toward righteousness. But Paul said, I still have to struggle. He had that struggle going on inside himself. You see, the basis of the law, when you go back in the book of 1 John, we find the most elemental characteristic of the nature of God. 1 John 4:8. He that loves not knows not God, for God is love. God is love. The most basic fundamental characteristic of the nature of God is that God is love. Now, as we come on back to Matthew 22, in verse 35, we find that a lawyer came with a question, tempting him, testing him, saying in verse 36, Master, what is the great commandment of the law? What's the most important thing? And Jesus said unto him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So, what he's saying is that, you see, how do you love? You say, God is love. Well, what is love? You see, you couldn't properly define love. People can use love for all sorts of things. People run off with their neighbor's wife and they say, well, we were in love is that really love? People have done a lot of things and claimed that they were doing it for the greater good. Hitler claimed he was killing all the Jews for the good of Germany. And he was, but you see, God defines love. Love is more than just an emotion. The whole mindset of God. God is love. Now, what's the most important thing in the law? Love God with all your heart. And secondly, just like it, love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. So, what we find is, first is love, the very basic nature of God. And then, that is expressed in two great points. Love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. Then you come down and everything else hangs on that. The first four commandments tell you how to love God. By not placing any gods before Him, by not worshiping idols, not taking His name in vain, keeping holy His Sabbath, which He's made holy, then how do you love your neighbor? How do you love your neighbor as yourself? Well, you start out by honoring your parents, who are the first neighbors that you have, and therein you learn respect, which is the basis of relating to everybody else you come in contact with. Then you show love to your neighbor by not committing murder, not committing adultery, not stealing, not lying, and not coveting. Can you imagine what a world it would be if people just kept one of the commandments? What if nobody stole? Nobody ever stole. You know, I got a pocket full of keys here. I wouldn't have to have a pocket full of keys. I wouldn't have any keys. Locksmiths are going to be, that'll be a profession that simply won't exist in the world tomorrow. You ever think about that? Now, we need it in the world today. I'm not knocking anybody that's a locksmith. But, you know, why do you have locksmiths? Why do you have to lock things up? Because people are dishonest. You remember the old cars? I mean, there was a time before there was a key. There was a time when I remember Daddy had an old truck. You pushed a button on, and you pushed the starter button. And, of course, you go back further, and you had some of your cranks. It had to be back in Buck Green's day before you crank hard. Crank hard. Why do you need a key? Because if you didn't have a key, if you just had a starter button, how long would your car sit out there? You know, you park it in the parking lot, somebody comes along, thinks it look pretty good, and they'd steal it. They go off with it. You know, you think of all the things. Think of the reduction in insurance, the reduction in prices, because when you consider all these stores, they have a certain amount of stuff that is stolen. Who do you think pays for that? The people who buy there, because that's where it has to come from. You know, now what we're going to do here in the remainder of the Bible study, I want to go back and to focus in on the commandments specifically, and let's see how some of these are amplified out. Let's see some of the things that are brought out, because the principles, every spiritual law, ultimately is based on one of the Ten Commandments. And all of the Ten Commandments are based on one of two principles, love to God or love to neighbor. And both of those two principles are based on the one great principle, which is the character of God, which is love. So there is an outflowing, and the Bible defines for us. Now, it's laid out in the Old Testament, and then Christ came and He amplified it. He expounded it, and He expounded the principle. And we're not to serve in oldness of letter, but newness of the Spirit. That doesn't mean you do away with it. You know, the difference is, let's look at an example between the oldness of the letter and the newness of the Spirit. Because some people think the spirit of the law sort of spiritualizes away the law. You know, that means you can break the law if you have a good attitude, which is, sort of a crazy way of looking at it. Can you murder somebody in sort of a good attitude? You know, well, no. You see, Christ amplified it. Here's the difference between the Spirit and the letter. This is back here in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. Let's just notice one example. Matthew 5:27. You have heard that it was said by them of old time, you shall not commit adultery. Now, where did Christ get that? Well, that comes right out of the Ten Commandments. Now, what is the oldness of the letter? Well, it is specifically, you shall not commit the physical act of adultery. Verse 28, what's the spirit of the law? Verse 28, I say unto you that whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. So Christ amplified the newness of the Spirit. See, the oldness of the letter is don't go out and commit the physical act. Christ amplified newness of spirit, and He said the spirit of the law goes beyond that. Not only do you not commit the physical act, but the attitude, the motivation that would ultimately result in the act. He goes on, and expounds that principle up in verse 21. You've heard it was said by them of old time, you shall not kill. Now, where did he get that? Well, that was right out of the Ten Commandments, too. Whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. Boy, you go out and commit murder, and you're going to be in trouble. I say unto you, verse 22, whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Whoever shall say to his brother, Raka, which is an expression of contempt, shall be in danger of the council, but whosoever shall say, you fool, just you absolutely worthless human being, is going to be in danger of hellfire. And he talks about reconciliation. See, the spirit of the law is, it's not enough just to refrain from taking a gun and blowing your neighbor away. You've got to come to love him, not carry a grudge, not carry a resentment, not have hostility, which is the spirit of murder. See, that's the contrast between the oldness of the spirit, the oldness of the letter, and the newness of spirit. That doesn't mean the oldness of the letter said, don't make idols, and the newness of the spirit is, well, we can have idols if we, have a good attitude about it or something. Whatever the Catholics use as their reasoning, and have the little statues up and all of this stuff. The spirit of the law doesn't mean that it's okay to have them. No, the spirit of the law goes beyond the letter. The oldness of the letter said, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. The spirit of the law goes beyond in just saying, look, it's not enough just to physically go through the act, but it involves an attitude. But the attitude, the spirit of the law is based upon the letter and goes beyond it. It includes it, but it is far more. It's far more involved. It involves the spirit and the intent of what is it that God is after. Now let's go back in Deuteronomy chapter 20, first commandment. God spoke all these words, Deuteronomy. Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the eternal your God, which have brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Exodus chapter 5 and verse 6 is very similar. It says, I am the eternal your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. You shall have none other gods before me. Now, God says that He is to come first, that we're to look to Him. That's why you find this commandment amplified in the Old Testament, in Exodus 22, for instance, and Exodus 22, verse 18. Under the civil law, the death penalty was decreed for witches and those who sacrificed to other gods. Let's notice in Exodus chapter 23, we'll just notice some of the statements here that amplify having no other gods before the true God. Exodus chapter 23, verse 13. In all these things, in all things that I have said unto you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the names of other gods, neither let it be heard in your mouth. Coming on down here in verse 24. You shall not bow down to their gods, speaking of the Amorites, Hittites, and Canaanites. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do after their works. You shall utterly overthrow them and break down their images. Now, you know what the Catholics did when they came in a lot of areas? They took the images and just sort of sprinkled a little holy water on them and said, now you're, you were this goddess and now you're the Virgin Mary, or whatever it is. Some of the various shrines, like down in Mexico, they have the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And, of course, if you go back and study the history of it, you find out that was an Indian shrine for some goddess they had down there. Well, they just kept the same thing, just changed the name. Well, God said that, you see, that debases the worship of the true God. God wants to be worshipped in sincerity and truth. He says, I'm the true God. I am the living God. I brought you out of Egypt. I rescued you. You're to have nothing in front of me. Nobody else. So he says you don't bow down, you don't serve it, you destroy it, and you break down their images. So it was a very detailed statement, you see, in terms of as it comes on down here, on down in verses 30 through 32, or 33 here in Exodus 23. God told them that little by little He would clear the land out and set their bounds from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean and to the from the Euphrates all the way down to the desert. And I'll deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand. You'll drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare unto you. See, once you start down the path of compromise, God told Israel, He said, I want the Canaanites out of the land. Because if you make a deal with them and they're there, it's going to be a snare. It's going to be a trap. You know what a snare is? You ever had a snare in the woods? It's not obvious what it is. It looks, it's a trap, but it's disguised to where the bird comes in or the animal comes in and it's covered over with some leaves or whatever so that it's not obvious until finally his foot's in the wrong spot and he's grabbed. And God, that's what God says here about the false gods of the pagans. He said those things will be a snare. It'll be a trap. It won't look that bad, but it will entrap you. And so He knew the tendency of human beings to pursue the path of compromise and to try to blend in with the society around them and be just like them. That's no new thing. That's not something that we have to contend with in our society. There's pressure. There's pressure on our kids. You know, our kids go to school, and there's pressure on them to conform, to keep Christmas or do whatever it is. Well, those are pressures our kids have to face. We have to face pressures. And there's always a pressure because if you live God's way, you're not living quite the way. You're not keeping the customs. You're not doing the things that the society around you does. And so God says, look, don't start down a road of compromise because you will begin to follow other gods. And you're to have no other gods before me. On back, it talks about in the book of Leviticus, it talks about the astrologers and the wizards and all the fortune tellers and all of these things. In Leviticus 19:31, regard not them that have familiar spirits, neither seek after wizards to be defiled by them. I am the eternal your God. So you don't pursue these things because that's connected to demonism. That's connected to false gods. Coming on down in chapter 20. Verse 1, Lord spoke to Moses and said, say to the children of Israel, whoever there be of the children of Israel or the strangers that sojourn in Israel, that give any of his seed unto Molech, he shall surely be put to death. I will set my face against that man and cut him off from among his people because he's given of his seed unto Molech to defile my sanctuary, to profane my holy name. And if the people of the land do anyways hide their eyes from the man when he gives his seed unto Molech and kill him not, then I'll set my face against that man and against his family and will cut him off and all that'll go a-whoring after him to commit whoredom with Molech from among their people. The soul that's turned after, such as have familiar spirits and wizards to go a-whoring after them, I'll set my face against them. See, God says, sanctify yourselves, be holy, for I'm holy. So the principle is that once you start down that path, Molech was the god of fire. And was tied in with the sun god, because the sun god, of course, was the god of fire. And you find that all of the horrible things that were involved in this worship. So God wants to be followed. He wants to be followed exactly, as it says back in Deuteronomy 12. on down, let's see, verse 29. When the Lord your God shall cut off the nations from before you where you go to possess them, and you succeed them and dwell in their land, take heed to yourself that you be not snared by following them after they're destroyed from before you. Don't inquire after their gods. How did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. You shall not do so unto the Lord your God, for every abomination of the Lord which he hates have they done unto their gods. You know, they've even burned their sons and their daughters in the fire. What things soever I command you, observe to do it. You shall not add thereto nor diminish from it. So, the way to worship God, God tells us we're to worship Him in sincerity and truth. Sincerity has to do with our attitude. Truth has to do with following the instructions He's given us. God doesn't want people looking and saying, well, you know, these pagans, they had this nice little custom. They put up a tree every December. You know, that's sort of pretty and lights, and that's nice. Why don't we do that? Only we won't call it Saturnalia. We'll call it the Mass of Christ. That's the idea. You know, a lot of people, boy, they think that's terrible. You mean you deprive your children of Christmas? Why, that's terrible. Well, God says, look, the way to worship Him is don't turn aside. You see, that's a transgression of having another God before the true God. If what people think matters more to us, what do we love the most? I went through Sermon Sabbath, about the truth and loving God's truth and what the truth means, and the fact that, Paul talks about in Titus, or talks about in 2 Timothy rather, one of those that had been with him, he says, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has returned to Thessalonica. Some people love the world, and they turn and go back into the world. Elsewhere it talks about some of the Pharisees and some of the Jews who knew the truth but refused to lack the courage to stand up and be counted. They wouldn't admit publicly in the synagogues, would not acknowledge that Jesus was the Messiah. It says, because the Pharisees had threatened that they would put out of the synagogues anybody that said that, and we're told there that for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Well, see, they had something before the true God. Demas loved the present world more than he loved God. Some of the leaders of the synagogue, some of the prominent Jews in Jerusalem in the time of Christ loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. So they had something before God. Now they thought if you'd told them they were breaking the first commandment, they'd have probably gotten indignant. But you see, when we put something in place of the true God, when our loyalty, our allegiance, our devotion comes to something or someone beyond or before God, that's a transgression of the first commandment. When we start compromising the worship of the true God and mixing it in with paganism, that's a breaking of the first commandment. When the things that God says belong to Him, even we look to God, we recognize the prerogatives of God, and we trust God as our protector, our provider, our healer, the one that we look to. These are the attributes and the characteristics of God. And so we live in a society where there's always a temptation to put our trust and faith in the things that can be seen rather than in the invisible God. Now, the second commandment is the commandment against idolatry. It says simply in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4, You shall not make unto you any graven image or any likeness of anything that's in heaven above or that's in the earth beneath or that's in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down yourself to them nor serve them. For I, the eternal your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generations of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto the thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Old sins cast long shadows. Idolatry is something that results in problems for generations. And it cuts people off from God. It creates a false image, a false concept, and it is not the way that God chooses to be worshipped. When you read about the temple and the tabernacle, you find that there was that there was art in the sense that it describes, various things that were drawn or that were done, when it describes, but it had nothing to do with let's say with a religious context as far as worship. Now, let's notice what God says about idolatry, and let's notice how this is amplified. Because, the Catholics, they get pretty indignant if you tell them that, they're, having these statues up and pictures that they do, that's idolatry. Well, they'll get upset, and, they'll say, oh, no, we don't worship these. Now, they're bowing down in front of it, they're burning a candle in front of it, they're kissing it, they're kneeling down in prayer with this thing standing there, but they're not worshiping. Well, let's see. Exodus chapter 20, you see, they say it just reminds them. Well,
my great grandkids says, yeah.
If we go back here to Exodus 34, Exodus 34:12, take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you go, lest it be a snare. You shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves. You shall worship no other God, but the Eternal, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. And, you're not to do any of these things. God wants to be worshipped exactly the way that He says. And so it says in verse 17, you shall make you no molten gods. So you don't, now does that mean, we didn't make a molten one, we carved it, and that, is that an improvement? We carved it out of wood. We didn't, mold it with molten gold or silver. Does that make a difference? No, we're going to see that. Back in the early Middle Ages, there was a big controversy, between the Greek church in the East and the Catholic church in the West. The Greeks accused the Catholics of being idolaters because the Catholics had statues that they worshipped. What the Greeks had was pictures. They would use pictures, and they were flat pictures on the wall. You've seen some of these pictures, made out of little pieces of colored glass or something. They're called icons, and they're sort of a very flat-looking picture. Well, they made those and said, see, we're not making molten images. You're making graven images. Well, let's look a little further, and let's see if the pictures that the Greek Orthodox made were in the same category as the other. Let's go back to Leviticus 26. Let's just look at a few of the verses that deal with it. Leviticus 26:1. You shall make no idols, nor graven image, neither rear up a standing image, neither shall you set up any image of stone in the land to bow down to, for I am the Lord your God. So they weren't to be putting up these images and idols and these various things that were to be a source of worship. Now, let's come on back to Numbers 33. Let's see a little more. Numbers 33 in verse 51. Speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when you're passed over Jordan unto the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their pictures, and destroy all their molten images, and white pluck down all their high places. Oh, so pictures were to be destroyed too. See, the point is, God says, I don't want you taking the things they use for the worship of pagan gods and adapting it to my worship, because the principle is we worship God as He says He wants to be worshipped. And people say, well, I think that's a nice looking little picture, and I think it'd be nice to have, this. And so you see some of those things that come up. And he puts the pictures in the same category as the molten images. It's just as bad to have to have one of these, pictures of Christ as it is to have a little painted statue. What's the difference? You're trying to take God and reduce Him down to something that is a piece of plaster or metal or a paper and pen. Now notice on back in Deuteronomy chapter 12, just notice one other thing here. We already looked at Deuteronomy 12 in the latter part, but let's look at the first part. Deuteronomy 12 verse 2 talks about when you go into the land to possess it. Deuteronomy 12:2, you shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which you shall possess serve their gods, upon the high mountains and upon the hills and under every green tree. Overthrow their altars, break their pillars, burn their groves, hew down their graven images, destroy the names of them out of that place. You're not to do so to the Lord your God. So, God says, look, I want you to tear down their places of worship. I want you to destroy their idols, to destroy their images, and burn their pictures. All the stuff connected with the worship of false gods is to be destroyed. Because if you leave any of it around, it has a way of sort of creeping in. Leads to compromise. And that is, of course, what God knew that ancient Israel would get involved in if they didn't do what He said exactly. And, of course, what did they do? Oh, they didn't do what He said exactly. And they did get involved in compromise and began to say, well, I don't see what difference this will make. I don't see what difference that will make. It just sort of, watered things on down until after a while they lost their identity. They were doing so much similar to what the Canaanites around them were doing that they weren't really that much different. And God knew that that would be the effect. So He told them, He gave them these commandments. You see, the first 4 commandments define our relationship with God. And that really, those commandments are to protect our relationship with God and to protect our identity as the people of God. Because if you lose your identity as the people of God, then you become just like the world. And you lose the knowledge of the true God and His plan and His purpose. Now, does that mean everybody in the world? See, the first commandments protect our identity in the way the last ones don't. The last ones are certainly important. You shouldn't kill and commit adultery and steal and all of this. But there are plenty of people in the world that don't go around killing people. There are people who are, from a worldly standpoint, honest, they're ethical, they're moral. Everybody who's unconverted isn't an axe murderer or something. There are people that from a worldly standpoint are good, decent people. I think most of us have had friends, neighbors, and relatives that are. And we've, of course, known some others that weren't too decent. That's just the way it is. But they didn't understand the plan of God, the purpose of God. They may have been good people as the world looks at it. But, you see, God wants us to be a holy people unto our God. He wants us to be like Him. He's called us to understand His plan and His purpose. He has a destiny for us, and He's going to deal with all of them in time. But right now is not the time when God's dealing with all the world. He wasn't dealing with all those Canaanites back then. We didn't tell Israel to send in missionaries and see if they could convert them all. That was not the time when God was going to deal with those people. He'll raise them up in the second resurrection. But He had a job for Israel, and He said, I don't want you to get involved in something that's going to compromise your identity, because you'll begin to blend with the world. You'll lose your identity. You'll lose sight of who I am. You'll lose sight of the things that separate you and make you distinct. You'll be just like everybody else. You won't be any different. You won't be my holy people. Now, in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 7 is a commandment that the world takes pretty lightly. It says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that takes His name in vain. Boy, a lot of people think that's about as trivial a commandment as you can have. They don't see any big deal in taking God's name and swearing in God's name and throwing in all sorts of words and terms. But it has to do with respect, with honoring and reverencing God. If we really hold God in honor and reverence, then we're going to use His name in a way that reflects that honor and that reverence. We're certainly not going to, to use God's name in a careless, casual manner. Because to use it in vain means to use it in an empty way, to no good purpose. And that includes, all of the certainly the cursing and the swearing that a lot of times people do and just drag God's name in and all sorts of bad language. But a lot of people just use God's name as a euphemism. They talk about by God. We're told we're not to profane God's name, not to use it in a careless way. Back in Leviticus chapter 18. Leviticus 18:21 says, "You shall not let any of your seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Eternal." So, here was something that was they were to show reverence and honor when they used God's name. Notice back in Leviticus 24, God wanted to make a point as to how serious this was. Leviticus 24 verse 10, "There was the son of an Israelitish woman whose father was an Egyptian. And he went out among the children of Israel, and he got in a fight with somebody, and he blasphemed the name of the Eternal and cursed. And they brought him to Moses. And they put him in ward, they locked him up, verse 12, to go and seek the mind of God. And God showed that he was to be brought forth and was to be stoned, verse 14. "And you shall speak unto the children of Israel, whosoever curses his God shall bear his sin. He that blasphemes the name of the Lord, he shall be put to death." Boy, that was serious business. God, respect is the basis of any society. This is a commandment that strikes right at the heart of respect to God. Because if you really respect and reverence and honor God, then you use His name, you don't use His name in vain. That's why we don't use names that pertain to God. That's why we don't use, in the church we don't go around and use the various names that a lot of religions use. Those of you who grew up in Catholic Church, you have Father so-and-so, and they have various titles, the Pope is the Most Holy Father. And they talk about the Holy Father. Well, who is the Holy Father? See, that's, who is the Holy Father? When Christ addressed the Father, He said, "Holy Father, keep through your own name those whom you've given me, that they may be one as we are." Back in John 17, who was He talking to, the Pope? It's blasphemous to take the name of God and give it to a man. Now we have two fathers. Because what is a father? A father is the one who begets you, right? I mean, that's what the father is. So there's only two ways you can be begotten. One is physically begotten and the other is spiritually begotten. So you got two fathers. You have a father on the physical level, on the human level. And so it says, honor your father and your mother. So you have a human father. And it's not wrong to refer to him as a father, because that's what he is. He is the human being that has begotten you and has given you life as a human being. And you have a spiritual father, one who has begotten you spiritually. And we become, therefore we're God's children, and we anticipate being a part of His family. Well, to take that title, that name, and apply it to a human being, that's why Christ said, see, back in the New Testament, Matthew, He says, "Call no man father." Well, now, He's not talking about your human father, because He used that term. The Bible uses that term to refer to the human parent. But you don't ever find where Peter's called Father Peter, or Paul is called Father Paul, or any of that. See, that's never used. Christ told the disciples, no, don't use those titles. Because you're putting yourself in the name of God. In the Masonic Lodge, the leader of the lodge is called the Most Worshipful Master. Well, who's the worshipful master? Who is the master worthy of worship? Well, it's God. You know, we're told back in the end of Psalms, what is it, Psalm 110, I believe it is, or Psalm 111, that I wouldn't phone oh yeah, it is Psalm 111. Psalm 111 verse 9. He sent redemption unto His people. He's commanded His covenant forever. Holy and reverend is His name. You know, we don't use those titles in that way, because to take God's names, the titles that pertain to God, and attach them to a human being is a violation of the third commandment. You see, God reserves certain names, certain titles, certain things that refer to Him. And for a human being, a human religious leader to come along and attach those titles to himself is a matter of blasphemy. You know, that's what it says when it prophesies, for instance, to the Catholic Church back in Daniel. Let's see here. Daniel 7, and it talks about how that in speaking of the little horn, the papacy, back in Daniel 7:25, he'll speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. Talks about in Daniel 7:8, this little horn. He had a mouth speaking great things. That it talks about the same thing back in Revelation 13. When it's talking about the beast, same parallel account to Daniel. In Revelation 13, it talks about the Daniel in Revelation 13:5, there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth to blaspheme against God and to blaspheme His name and His tabernacle and them that dwell therein. He took God's name in vain. That's what it means to blaspheme. He attached God's names and God's titles to himself. And it describes that system, you see, which shows dishonor to God, because when you take what pertains to God and describes God and apply it to a human being, then you are showing disrespect for God. Now, the fourth commandment is brought out here in Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. "6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But in the seventh day is the Sabbath of the eternal your God. In it you shall not do any work, you nor your son, or your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that's within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Now, a couple of things come out. One, the Sabbath we see here is anchored to creation. You see, God made what we see and rested on the seventh day. So the seventh day is hallowed from creation. God says in Exodus 31 that it's a sign between Him and His people forever. Now, a sign is to identify. When you have, a sign on a truck or on a building or something, it identifies who it belongs to. The Sabbath is a sign. It is a sign that identifies God, and it is a sign that identifies His people. Notice Exodus 31:13. "Speak unto the children of Israel and say, Truly, my Sabbath you shall keep. It's a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the eternal that does sanctify." Who is the God that we serve? He's the God of creation. So we serve the Creator God, the one that in the beginning made the heavens and the earth, the one that refashioned and formed and shaped the earth and the sea and all the things that are therein, and put the plants and the animals upon it, and ultimately human beings made it in His own image in 6 days and 6 nights. There's recorded in Genesis chapter 1. And on the 7th day, He rested. And He sanctified it. He set it apart and made it holy. And so the Sabbath is a sign. You see, it identifies God put His presence in time. And He made it holy. God's the only one that can make something holy. Because God is holy. See, holy and reverend is His name. God is holy, and where God places His presence is holy. And so God set apart time. Now, you can't go out and look at sunset and be able to tell the difference between the Sabbath and any other day just looking at the way the sun looks when it sets. The only way you know which time the only way you know is because God said this particular period of time is holy and special. And it's a sign. It identifies God as the true God, the Creator, and it identifies the people who worship Him and serve Him. Now, He says you do it. It's holy. I'm going on in Exodus 31, the Sabbath, in verse 15. The 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever does any work in the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. The 7th day He rested and was refreshed. Now, let's understand, it says it's a sign between God and the children of Israel forever. Well, what about today? You know, God's calling people, not only Israelites, what about Gentiles when they're converted? Well, Galatians 3:29 says, if you be Christ, then are you Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. A Christian becomes a spiritual Israelite. All Christians, regardless of whether they're Gentile or Israelite, become spiritually an Israelite. You see that, as Paul explained it in Romans chapter 3, or Romans 2 verse 29, he is a Jew which is one inwardly. See, verse 28 of Romans 2, he's not a Jew which is one outwardly. He's a Jew which is one inwardly, circumcision of the heart in the spirit. See, if we become spiritually, if we become Christ, then we're inwardly a Jew. If you're Christ, you're Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And so, when we're told that the Sabbath is a sign between God and His people forever, it identifies. And it identifies that there's only one reason to observe the Sabbath. See, the Sabbath identifies those who are obeying God, and it identifies the God whom we obey. It identifies, it's a sign of obedience, because there's only one reason to do it. And that's the fact that God said so. There are a lot of reasons people don't kill. One of the chief of which is they're afraid of going to jail. There are a lot of people who kill somebody if they weren't scared to get thrown in jail and spend years in Angola. Of course, obviously that doesn't stop some, but it does stop quite a number. A lot of people don't steal because they're afraid of going to jail. They don't do certain things. But for the Sabbath, the only reason to keep the Sabbath is because we're willing to obey the Creator God. And if God says it's holy, we're willing to keep it that way. And so we find that all of the commandments, all of the things that amplify the Sabbath. You see, the spirit of the law goes on beyond to show that we learn to keep the Sabbath not only in the letter, but on the inside as well as on the outside. You know, an unconverted person can keep the Sabbath in the letter. There are Jews who kept the Sabbath in the letter. They quit work before Friday sunset and didn't start up again till after Saturday sunset. They observed the letter of the law. And some of them have invented all sorts of their own rules and regulations that don't come out of the law. The spirit of the law is, yes, we refrain from work from sunset to sunset, but we realize there's also a positive aspect of keeping it holy in our mind and our thoughts and our attitude and our relationship to God. So it is a matter of obedience. And you could go on through that all of the commandments really that relate to holy time in the Scriptures amplify and are based on the fourth commandment. Now, let's sort of pick up speed a little bit here with as we look at some of the others. The fifth commandment tells us you're to honor your father and your mother that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you. Exodus 20 verse 12. To show honor and respect to our parents is fundamental. This is the commandment that bridges from relationship to God to relationship to neighbor. Because God is our Father in the spiritual sense. He's the ultimate Father. He is our Creator. But we have a father and a mother on a human level. So this commandment is sort of a bridge commandment, and it deals with the subject of respect. To show honor, to show respect. And that's an important starting point because no society can endure and have stability if there's not respect. And if children can't learn to show respect to their parents at home, who are they going to respect? Part of the problem in our society, the reason things are so violent and things are so out of control, is you find people that don't have any respect for anyone. You got kids, young punks roaming the streets in a lot of these cities. They don't respect anybody or anything except somebody's got a bigger gun. That's all. They never learned respect. A lot of them never even knew who their father was, much less learning to honor him. They grew up in this sort of a situation. They did not learn to honor their father and their mother. And then, as you go on from there, those who are in authority, it would carry over to teachers, it would carry over to those who are in positions of authority and responsibility. When you tear down respect, you have no basis for a society to continue and to endure. Because when respect is gone, all you're left with is the law of the jungle, the survival of the fittest. The big animal eats the little animal. And that's a horrible situation. Might makes right. And honor is an important starting point. And we could go through examples. It talks about the various principles, all the things connected with family. God, the family is very important to God. We find that two commandments are very directly related to the family: honor your parents and don't commit adultery. And the 10th commandment of not coveting what belongs to your neighbor, including his wife, is certainly another aspect of protecting the family. Protecting the family. Because the family is important to God. That's the basis of human relationships and the starting point for society. Christ amplified and expounded this. You find we could go through various points in the Old Testament in terms of Leviticus 19:32 about rising up before those who are elderly, showing respect for those who are older. We find that the various places where God talks about children being the gift of God, and God even gave the father certain authority. For instance, in Numbers 30 verses 3 through 5 about being able to nullify vows of children. It talks about Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 6 how important it is for the parents to teach God's laws to their children. And, their laws of inheritance. All of these things, all of these aspects of the commandments build on this fifth commandment. They're amplifications of the principle that deal with the integrity of the family unit and the honor that's to be shown. The sixth commandment, Numbers 20 verse 13, thou shalt not kill. Now, literally the Hebrew word for kill means murder. God allowed the taking of life in certain contexts in the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, he told Noah that the death penalty was to be exercised for murder, for first-degree murder. That whosoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. You see, the sanctity of human life is based on the fact that we're made in the image of God. Human life has sanctity in a way that the lives of animals don't. And that's we see in our society, the abortion and all of this sort of thing, which is really involves an approach toward life, a devaluing of human life. I'm saying that human life really is nothing more than just, got an unwanted dog or cat, got some puppies that we want to get rid of, so we'll go throw them in the pond. And you've got people that treat little human beings that way, and worse. You've got, our whole society is just so absolutely violent. Well, God placed great emphasis on the importance of human life and said that premeditated murder, out and out murder was to be dealt with in that way, with the death penalty. So God viewed violence as a very major thing. Now, in ancient Israel, they were allowed to, God used them and allowed them to, as a carnal nation, to be involved in wars. But in the New Testament, we find that Christ amplified the spirit of the law of thou shalt not murder to show that we are not to do violence to our neighbor. Period. That's not the way that we're to interact, or that's not the things we're to do. That John the Baptist told even Roman soldiers that came to him wanting to be baptized in Luke 3:14. The soldiers demanded of him, saying, "What shall we do?" Now, John didn't preach that you don't have to do anything. He said, "Do violence to no man. Neither accuse any falsely. Be content with your wages." So here they were, specifically it would have been undoubtedly the Jewish members of the services there that came down to John's baptism, and he said, if you're going to really repent, you can't do violence to any man. Christ amplified it in the Sermon on the Mount. We read it a little earlier. Said unto you of old time, don't kill, don't murder. I say, but you can't hold a grudge. You can't have a resentment. You can't have the spirit of murder in your heart. But see, God's after our becoming like Him, which involves going beyond the letter of the law. It includes the letter of the law, but it goes beyond it. See, the spirit of the law on the sixth commandment doesn't mean that you can blow somebody's head off as long as you have a good attitude. You sort of love them in your heart. That's ridiculous. You see, it's not only do you not murder them, you not kill them. Don't hold a grudge. Don't have the spirit of murder. Because that, which then, what is the spirit of the law? If you're not going to murder them, you're not going to have hatred and resentment, then what are you going to do? Well, you need to have kindness. You need to be helpful. If you're not going to hurt them, you need to help them. You need to have an attitude of kindness and of help, of outgoing concern. You see, that is the spirit of the law. Paul expounded we'll see just in a few moments, the one on stealing. The seventh commandment, Exodus 20 verse 14, thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, we find that there's certainly many principles in the Scripture that go through and expound that. In the Old Testament, all the laws against immorality that dealt with fornication, that dealt with homosexuality and bestiality and every sort of perversion, all of the things that were done, all were based on this law which had to do with faithfulness in marriage. And that the only proper and appropriate use for sex is between a husband and a wife in marriage. And anything else is a violation of the principle here. And thou shalt not commit adultery. Christ expanded it in the New Testament, as we read earlier in Matthew 5, to involve even the attitude and the spirit of adultery. He addressed the subject in Matthew, back here, what is it, Matthew 19, where they ask him questions about divorce in Matthew 19. And in verse 6, Matthew 19:5, "To this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder." And so then they asked him about divorce, and he said, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, allowed you. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, if you're putting away your wife other than for fornication, for gross immorality, and marry another, you're committing adultery." So you see, the widespread lack of regard for marriage, taking lightly the marriage covenant, involves the breaking of the spirit of the law when it comes to thou shalt not commit adultery. That has to do the positive aspect of that commandment. It's addressed in the negative. You're not to murder. Well, if you're not to murder, what are you to do? You're to love. You're to be concerned with. You're to help. You're to be kind to. You're not to commit adultery. Well, what are you to do? You're to be faithful to your mate. Before you're married and while you're married, you're to be faithful to your mate in mind and in body. That's the spirit of the law. The eighth commandment says, "Thou shalt not steal." Again, it's stated in the negative form. You shall not steal. Don't take away what belongs to somebody else. You can go back in Exodus 22, and it talks about how thieves need to make restitution. Because that was God's principle. Today if somebody steals something from you, chances are you'll never get it back, and they don't have to make restitution. They may have to go to jail or pay a fine to the state. But will they have to make restitution? No. That was God's law. You see, one thing about stealing, the law against stealing, it shows that God does allow for and recognize private property. It's not communism. You got to have something to steal. You got to have private property, or there wouldn't be any stealing. Now, this is amplified even in the Old Testament. It talks about not in Exodus 19, 11, 12, and 13. It talks about robbing a hired person of his wages by keeping back what belongs to the hired man. Well, that's a way of stealing. It talks about in Exodus 19, 35, and 36 about just weights. Don't put your thumb on the scales using just weights. Deuteronomy 19:14 talks about not moving a neighbor's landmark. So you're not trying to. You don't steal. There's more ways to steal than just go in and rob a 7-Eleven. It talks about just weights and measures. Let's notice in Ephesians 4, let's notice how Paul shows the expansion of the principle. Ephesians 4:28. "Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands, the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needs." See, this is the spirit of the law. The law says don't steal. That's in the negative form. Don't steal. Well, if you're not going to steal, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to work and be productive so you can give and help and share. So if you're not going to murder, what are you supposed to do? Well, be kind and be helpful and try to build up and help and encourage. If you're not going to commit adultery, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to be faithful in body and mind to your mate. If you're not going to steal, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to work and be productive so you can give and help and share with those that are needy. If it says thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. That's the 9th commandment. Exodus 20 verse 16. Don't lie. Well, if you're not going to lie, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to speak the truth in love. You see, that's what we're told to do. We don't, in the Old Testament, it talked about deceitfulness and lying. It talked about, in Leviticus 19, 11 and 12, don't deal falsely and lie. It talks in Leviticus 19:16, don't be a talebearer or a slanderer. It talks about paying all your vows to God, not bearing false witness. Christ amplified the spirit of the law in Matthew chapter 5. He brought out something people had never really thought about before. He says in Matthew 5:33, you've heard it said by them of old time, don't forswear yourself, perform unto the Lord all your oaths. Verse 34, I say unto you, don't swear at all. Don't swear at all. Verse 37, let your communication be yea, yea, and nay, nay. Oh, if you always tell the truth, you don't need to swear. You don't need to bring God into it as though, boy, I'm really telling the truth this time by all that's holy, and you're holding up your hand and got the other one on a stack of Bibles. Well, if somebody's a liar, how many Bibles they got under their hand is not going to make them a truth teller. I'd rather have the word of an honest man than a 100-page contract by a crook. Because the principle Christ brings out is, you see, the commandment says, in the negative form, don't bear false witness unto your neighbor. Well, if you're not going to bear false witness against your neighbor, what are you going to do? Are you going to be a faithful and a true witness? Truth is part of the essence of God's character. You're going to be true in all the aspects of your life. You're going to bear witness to the truth by your life, by your conduct, by your words. You're going to be someone that can be counted on and depended on. You're not going to be shady and sneaky and conniving, but you're going to be speaking the truth in love. You see, you're going to be, you're not going to be trying to tear down and trying to misrepresent, but you're going to be an individual of truth. And, of course, the final commandment, the 10th commandment, don't covet. Don't covet. Exodus 20, verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that's your neighbor's. Our whole society is based on, in terms of, let's say, much of advertising in contemporary society is geared on trying to incite lust in people, trying to get people to covet, to desire what's not theirs and they're not really entitled to. You look at ads. If they're advertising blue jeans, it seems like now they've got to put some sort of a slinky model into them. And if they're advertising men's jeans, well, they try to have this very sexually oriented advertisement of featuring a young man. If they're advertising women's jeans, well, they got to have, it's got to have this sort of lust arousing, covetous arousing advertisement. You see it from cars to automobiles to alcohol. There's all this concept, trying to arouse in people the desire for something that's not theirs and that they can't afford and is not really pertaining to them. See, the principle of don't covet is a matter of being thankful and appreciative for what we have. Being thankful and appreciative to God for what we have, and having a respect for what belongs to somebody else. It's the opposite of being greedy and grasping in the way of Jeff. And you see, it brings you full circle, because what is the God that most people put before the true God? Material things. See, covetousness leads to idolatry. Paul even defines in the New Testament covetousness, which is idolatry. You see, you just go full circle. So when we look at the law of God, we find that the law of God amplifies how to love God and how to love our neighbor, all of which are based on the principle of love, which is the nature of God, and that God's law is given to us to define for us the difference between good and bad, right and wrong. By the law, there is the knowledge of sin. That's the way you know what's right and what's wrong. The works of the law are not the way we become justified and become innocent. You can't earn through the carrying out of rituals or any sort of practice, you can't earn forgiveness for the sins of the past. Christ died to pay for those sins. But if we want to accept that payment, we have to repent, which means to turn away from sin, and sin is the breaking of law. So God's law reflects and amplifies God's love. And we've tried to look at in this series of Bible studies a lot of different aspects of the law, and we've looked into details of certain laws that we maybe often don't go into, understanding how some of these things relate together. But I hope that the Bible study this evening sort of puts it in perspective and gives us a perspective on God's law as a positive way of life, reflecting the love of God and the basis of how we can relate to God, maintain our identity as His people, relate to our neighbor, and show kindness and concern for those who are made in the image of God, and reflect back having the love of God shed abroad in our hearts, reflected out through our actions, which flow through the channel that is defined by God's law. With that will be concluded this evening.